participated on. It's been a one-way delivery of content. So it's nice to see faces, smiling faces, and sun shining through those windows. So I am here in Dartmouth. It's a beautiful day here, so we'll take advantage of that. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. I don't think the word expert was noted in my my bio, largely because I don't like that word. Some of you may have heard in the past that old adage that when you break down the word expert into its two syllables, X and spurt, X is an unknown quantity and spurt is a drip under pressure. And none of us want to be known as an unknown drip under pressure. So really pleased to be here. Let's move into this. Louise is going to advance my slides. I'm going to take about 20 minutes to share the overview of the ReImagine RREC initiative, and happy to answer questions and have a chat afterwards as well. All right, so let's move to the next slide then. Thanks, Louise. Great. I do also want to acknowledge that I am here in Mi'kma'ki, which is the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, based on the Treaty of Friendship that was signed way back in 1725. I and others here in Nova Scotia, including Luke, who's on the line, appreciate and value our place here on the unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. So over to the next slide, Louise. Thanks. So I'd like to begin by introducing you to the varied group of individuals who have been engaged and actually led on the effort to develop the ReImagine RREC initiative. And I'll stop here by making one important point. I'm here today essentially representing the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association. I am not an employee of the Parks and Recreation Association, but I and the others that you'll see on screen here shortly contributed to the development and the delivery of the ReImagine RREC initiative on behalf of the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association. So I want to acknowledge the CJ Noble's leadership, the leadership of the board, and their support for this initiative. So John Frittenberg on the left was the lead consultant on the ReImagine RREC initiative. Louise, you can bring up the rest of the images. There you go. Some of these folks you would most of you, maybe some of you know, they include Diane English, Brian Johnston, Larry Ketchison, and our friend Pierre from the Quebec region. And so historically, I'll just say that the ReImagine RREC, RREC being an acronym for Renew, Retool, Engage, and Contribute, was born out of a discussion that John and I had when the pandemic came into our respective lives in March of 2020, because our phones were ringing, just like yours probably were. And people were calling from all over the country to say, what does this mean for our community, for recreation, sport, physical activity promotion? How do we manage this? And what do we do now? And all of the answers at that time was, we don't know, because we were in it for the first time, just like everybody, not only here in Canada, but of course, globally. But what we did realize is that we thought it would be important to do some work to figure out how to provide how to provide information to help people make informed decisions on how to manage their way through. And I'll remind you, just as you probably thought at the time, in March of 2020, we thought this would be a weeks-long initiative, that we would be trying to figure out how to get out of this in maybe 2 to 3 months. And here we are, as Heather noted, in wave 6 and 2+ years later. We're not out of it yet. So an awesome, stellar team of individuals who have had a lot of time in the recreation, sport, physical activity promotion, population health arena. So next slide, please, Louise. Thanks. So what we'll cover today are really these 6 topics. I'll talk about what RREC is, why it was created. And we'll talk about the scope of findings generally, about key learnings and learnings around how we might want to look at recovery We'll talk about some knowledge transfer activities that were undertaken to impart the findings to leaders across the country, and also what's in play. In other words, we'll talk, because we only have a limited amount of time today, about two key findings that relate to outdoor play that I hope will be important to your mandates, your work, your very good work that you're doing across the country. So thanks again. Next slide, please. Thanks. All right. So essentially, in determining the attributes and the components of the ReImagine RREC initiative way back when, we landed on 4 activities across 4 domains. The domains are located on the right-hand side. So we wanted to know the impact and the emerging implications for people, places, policy, and programs in recreation, largely, but community sport and physical activity promotion as well. We undertook a look at a range of surveys, both domestically and internationally. I'm going to unpack these a little bit for you in upcoming slides. We commissioned a scoping review to look at the academic literature as it was at the time, which was still very much emerging, because of course, this was the largest social experiment across the globe in modern history, and there was not much in the evidence, the base of evidence around the implications, where to from here. But that, of course, has changed, hasn't it, substantially globally. We also undertook an effort to talk to leaders like yourself. We engaged a whole bunch of leaders across sectors in focus groups, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And lastly, we thought it was important to begin to document, which was an ongoing effort on the part of CPRRA, promising in what we termed next practices. In other words, when the new normal comes around, what will be the next practices that will sustain, firstly, the delivery of quality recreation programs for Canadians, but also other offerings, including those connected to outdoor play. Note at the bottom that this was essentially situated as a knowledge to action initiative, and we rooted it in proven theory as well. So next slide, please. So the survey data look like this. We looked at 103 distinct surveys across the world. The majority of them came from the global community, a lot from Europe, and a lot from other places that where the pandemic was already implicating lives and daily life, right? We were a little bit behind that curve, so much of this came from the global community. We captured surveys that were targeted at professionals working in sport, recreation, physical activity, but from other sectors as well, but also from individual Canadians and individuals across countries across the world. Between the periods of March 2020 and March 21, 38%, about 40% of those were from organizational-based surveys. So we got input from the professional groups, but also general population. This was no small assessment of the existing survey across the global community. No less than almost 500,000 respondents it represented. And as I say, about 70% was international. On to the next slide. The scope of findings for the scoping review was also as exhaustive. We hit on thousands and thousands of publications. We landed on about 250 of those. You see from the left here that the majority of those were empirical data and commentary. As I've noted earlier, there wasn't a lot of evidence-based case studies or literature reviews at the time with respect to what this means for recreation, what this means for physical activity, outdoor play, etc. And so much of the findings from the scoping review were institutional reports, were data that came from a range of, including Canadian organizations. But again, a lot of it was from the US and other centers. And the idea here was to learn from where they were ahead of the curve, rather behind the curve, so that we could figure out, based on their learnings, where to go from here. And you can see that they were spread out across the 4 domains that we looked at, right? People, programs, and places. So on to the next one, please, Louise. Great. The focus groups were awesome because we gathered no fewer than 170 people from across Canada. We covered the geographic expanse of Canada from sea to sea to sea and in the north. We ensured that we had representation from urban, suburban, rural, northern, remote communities as well. We did so in both official languages, and I should add that all of this was delivered and captured in both official languages across Canada, and that information lies on the CPRE website. I'll talk about that in a bit. We also did a series of special focus groups on key issues that we knew were emerging for leaders like yourself and for others across the country on things like IDEA or DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, recognizing and acknowledging that the biggest hit in terms of impact, once again, were on those subpopulations that were burdened by inequities coming into the pandemic, and they were exacerbated by the pandemic. We did another one on gender equity. We did another one on big cities, Toronto and 4 other big cities across the country to get the urban perspective. We did one in rural Canada, specifically in focus groups. And so you can see some of the people who gathered in those focus groups. They lent to our thinking around identifying key pillars for action, what the needs are, expressed needs of community leaders from across the country, including senior level leaders, mid-level managers, but also really importantly, volunteers. And I would just go on record to say, as you probably know, one of the major impacts for our sector is the paucity of volunteers returning to our community-based organizations because they were lost during the closures or for reasons related to either perceived lack of safety. We're still trying to get some of them back. It also led us to strategies for action, which we're going to talk about here in terms of what to do with this information. So the focus groups were awesome, and they were very, very important to get a sense and a signal and a pulse on what leaders like you were saying from across the country. Next slide, please, Louise. Then we collected these promising or next practices. We had about 70 submissions. CPRA cast out a call for submissions. We had about 45 of them screened in based on some basic criteria that we had set. Some are in English and in French. We were able to represent about 7 jurisdictions, and that was an open intake process. It still is kind of semi-open in the sense that if you have a story to tell about what you had done or continue to do to adapt and to renew and to retool your efforts to engage all Canadians in outdoor play, CPRA, I know, would be welcome of that story, and you can find more information about the intake process on the CPRA website. So those are the 4 key components. These were undertaken largely beginning in the fall in the January of 20. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up on dates because we're all still living in this. Yeah, starting in March of 2020 forward. All right, next slide, Louise. Thanks. Good. And so what resulted from the gathering of this information across the four domains of work? First of all, there was a helpful executive summary produced that spoke to the key findings from ReImagine RREC and all of the data gathering, but then explicit, particular, and very detailed reports on each of the 4 domains. The survey data collection and an analysis report, the scoping review report are no less than in their both of their cases about 350 or 400 pages in length, because they deliver on the specificity, the explicit findings. And the next practices and the summary of the key informant interviews and working groups are also excellent sources of lengthy reading, but important reading. So the executive summary can be found on the CPRA website, but also on the CPRA's The Bench. The Bench is the virtual community of practice that CPRA has set up for several years now. It is a membership-based community of practice. You can sign up. I do have a link on this deck when this deck is shared with you that you can go to, but you can also just Google CPRA The Bench. You'll come to the page that allows you to sign up. And in the section there, you'll find headings including on initiatives, and under initiatives, you'll find ReImagine RREC. So you can go there and find some of these reports. So English and French as well. Both all these reports are available in both official languages. So on we go to the next slide. I want to stop and perhaps say something that is clearly obvious to all of you, but no less important as we continue to find our way through the pandemic as a sector. It has been clearly unprecedented, not only for our community, for our sector of society, but clearly for every sector of society. And if there is one common thread that has run through the attempts to manage our way through this, and that will continue going forward, it is the notion that safety, public safety, will remain job one for those who are working in the space of physical activity promotion, recreation, and community sport, including those like yourself who have a mandate and an interest to support outdoor access to the outdoors and outdoor play. Now, on the one hand, it's clear that literally people ran and walked to outdoor settings at the front end of the pandemic, even when lockdowns were in play and when there were on again, off again openings and closings, local parks, provincial parks, outdoor settings in the civic space were obviously inundated with people. And that was obviously a good thing, both for people's physical health and also the mental health and for social connection as well. But it has brought upon the community a whole range of different considerations, including challenges that remain in place today with respect to outdoor access to the outdoors. And one of those with respect to safety is not only related to protection against transmission of COVID-19, but of overuse, for example. So with the idea that people were flocking to local parks, trails, greenways, other civic spaces, you could probably tell some explicit stories of where that overuse became a problem in terms of safety. Where do you park? Where do people park their cars? The great number of people, sometimes 300 to 500% increase in use on trails in local parks. In Montreal, for example, they were renting out by a sign-in system picnic tables. You may have heard that was one of the strategies that the local recreation office undertook. So at the center, though, is the idea that there is a hierarchy of control that was adopted by the CDC, by the WHO, the World Health Organization, and by many public health institutions and authorities in Canada. And it's central to this hierarchy here, where, of course, the most effective way to ensure the safety of the public and of staff and of volunteers is elimination of the transmission at the top end, and at the bottom end, less effective as you go down, substitution, engineering controls, particularly within the physical infrastructure of environments, administrative controls, personal protective equipment, and so on. One of the workshops, which I'll speak of, that we delivered, dealt specifically and explicitly with this issue. We broke it down into all kinds of helpful practical information on a safe return to recreation community sport. And so we'll talk about that as we go forward. There is a paper on this piece that was developed and published by Kevin Wilson al. here, and the link is at the bottom here as well. So Next slide, please, Louise. So what did we learn from all of this? Firstly, we learned that the organizational capacity of our sector has been reduced to a fundamental level. In a report that came out from Sport for Life Society in June of 2021, I think it was, yes, they identified, based on a survey that they did, that 21% of community sporting organizations would not return to operations because of lack of revenue, obviously closures, et cetera. You know that in your respective communities from across Canada, whether you are an employer or a volunteer, that our community-based organizations have suffered a great impact, and the implications are not short-lived. They will remain long-lasting in terms of how the organizations, whether it be those who are providing opportunities for outdoor play or community-based organized sport or community-based recreation, are at a loss to be able to deliver at a threshold of quality their programs and offerings. And so this remains one of the bigger challenges. And this was not something that we concluded as a team. It came from the 4 domains of inquiry that we had undertaken and was consistent across the board in terms of where the community finds itself still today. The next click on that slide, please, Louise. So new modalities of programming. Obviously one of the obvious is the virtual delivery of programming. You folks work in a space that probably is more hybrid in the sense of working and delivering opportunities in an organized fashion, but also in an unstructured fashion in terms of outdoor play. And that bodes well. I think you already know that, but you should know that our findings were consistent with the value proposition of what outdoor play means even more now to Canadians across the life course. It's obvious to you, but you should know that the findings from our work underscored this in spades. And the continuation of efforts of program delivery agents to ensure that we continue to build on different modalities of programming that are organized in-house, virtual or hybrid in the context of where people are and getting to them through virtual technology, moving things outdoors in their entirety, including outdoor classrooms and outdoor play opportunities, pop-up opportunities of the sort that you folks are involved with, and many, many others that you know about. The value that other sectors of society, including elected officials, see against those offerings now has increased, and it presents an amazing for the wrong reasons, but an amazing opportunity to advocate, position, and to call on the support of other sectors to recognize, acknowledge, and support outdoor play and access to the outdoors in a broader sense. And we're going to talk more about that as we go forward. Supporting facility transformation. I'll spend less on this, but for the recreation community, sport community, you can obviously see how that is central to what they need to pay attention to, what they need to consider investing in at a time when revenue generation is down. The idea that facilities need to be at a minimum made safe by way of how you move people through buildings, managing pinch points, obviously social distancing, putting up screens and barriers, but even more fundamental, retrofitting buildings, HVAC and clean air. But also the idea that buildings in the context of healthy buildings, which is not a new concept from an engineering perspective, but it has shot up in importance, hasn't it? Because everywhere that we go inside, as mask mandates come out, that will be not only a nice to offer, but a requirement from a public health perspective. in many jurisdictions. And so building transformation in terms of retrofitting and where you're building new facilities will remain at the forefront of a challenge going forward. So next slide, there's 3 more learnings that we came out with. And there, by the way, I should say there were actually about 12 or 13 themes that surfaced from our findings from ReImagine RREC, but these 6 are really 6 of the top ones. Re-engaging equity deserving groups. I love this image because it speaks in 10,000 words to the difference in the importance of equality versus equity. And we know, of course, that in our community, in recreation, sport, physical activity promotion, we were living and supporting systemic and structural barriers to access well before the pandemic, but of course that was exacerbated as the pandemic came on, and the impact of that for those who had less access, who among them affordability was an issue for older Canadians, for Canadians with a disability. This remains a critical, important aspect, inclusive of those of you who work in the space of outdoor play. And I know that it is in fact on your radar, but just to say that it came out in spades with respect to the findings from our data. And I know that I think the last session that you delivered in this forum here was on equity, diversity, and inclusion, which of course I'm sure was helpful. So the last 2 are ones that I want to expand on as we go forward, because they are directly related to your area of work, your mandate, your interests. So that is the obvious heightened use and demand for outdoor spaces and unstructured movement. And importantly for all of us, the need to pay particular attention to how changing public preferences, expectations, and behaviors will determine our future as a sector going forward, vis-a-vis the contribution that we need to continue to make to community recovery, community renewal, and our place in the broader socioeconomic world in communities. And so that's what the C in REC means, right? Renew, retool, engage, and contribute. We as a sector historically, less now, but historically, have, I'd say in some pockets across the country, have been accused of being isolated, working in isolation and silos, not working as much across policy domains with public health, with transportation, with infrastructure, with environment. That's not true today. What the pandemic has allowed us to do is open up and cast the net wider towards partnerships and collaboration. And we're going to talk about that just a little bit. So next slide, please. And so this is a slide that Heather recognizes because it's hers. Heather did a presentation as part of one of our ReImagine RREC workshops, which I'll talk about shortly, just last month. And this speaks to the priorities that were identified by Outdoor Play Canada in the State of the Sector report. And you can just go back. Yeah, awesome. So where I've added check marks are to say that these issues and priorities also surfaced out of the ReImagine RREC data gathering and themes. In fact, all of these are consistent. Different weights that were given to these issues in our findings, but it's interesting to see that clearly ReImagine RREC was focused on COVID-19 recovery, which is obviously central to this organization and all organizations, but so too did it conclude that we needed to consider and unpack opportunities for professionals and leaders and volunteers on how to manage these issues across the board. And the one at the bottom right, outdoor play environments, obviously for you is central to your work and was identified within the context of community-based recreation, community sport, as being something that needs to be much more readily, visibly, strategically positioned going forward. So I'll give an example. The Canadian sport policy is in a process of being renewed in its third iteration for a 10-year period. And recreational sport has always been a pillar of the Canadian sport policy. In the context of that pillar, much more consideration is being given to unstructured access to unstructured movement, health enhancing movement, notwithstanding that sport by definition is about prescribed, organized movement. The idea that recreational sport as a key pillar needs to consider the impacts of the pandemic in ways that make sense for Canadians on how they want to move from a perspective of participation, but really important, another aspect of where the CSP will be going, in my view, is the public health and the health lens, right? The idea that sport for development, sport for participation, and other priorities of the Canadian sport policy will also even more now embrace a sport for health. So I wanted to make clear that these parallels exist between the REC initiative and OPC's work. So next slide. So what does it mean for all of us, not only for recreation, community sport, physical activity, but for outdoor play? And what it means in broad buckets is that the policy implications are complex, they are many, they are challenging, and the program impacts for how you work now in terms of positioning your value in the community is changing, has changed, will continue to change. In many ways, that is from the perspective of being of offering new positive opportunities to engage Canadians in outdoor play because of where we are with respect to the pandemic. But you can see that some of these issues that are noted here on this word screen are in and of themselves individually very fundamental, and all of them are being considered and needing to be dealt with in an interconnected, strategic way if recovery at the center of this screen is to be successful for recreation, community sport, and physical activity promotion. The outdoors will factor centrally in the recovery success of the community. And it behooves Outdoor Play Canada to continue to do the very good work that it is doing, but double down on opportunities for collaboration, for partnerships, for demonstrating by way of data and evidence its value against the offerings more globally in our community. I'll just refer to the City Maximum report that was tweeted out by OPC just, I think, this morning or perhaps yesterday. These documents and reports are being seen by those people like me who, like some of you, work more globally in population health, in chronic disease prevention, in sport and recreation, and in other domains. And they're being paid heed in terms of where the outdoors represents a huge strategic opportunity, and where play from the perspective of physical health and mental health and emotional health and all of the other great attributes, including social connection and access for underserved populations, represent opportunities. So next slide. So what do we do with this data? Next slide, please, Louise. We commissioned 5 workshops. They were comprehensive 90-minute workshops across the country. We started in the fall of 21. We just finished the last one on March 1st. As I mentioned, Heather and other players in the outdoor space gladly contributed to one of them, Support of Outdoor Spaces and Places, that was convened on January 27. A couple of things I want to tell you about these. First of all of them are archived on the CPRA's The Bench. So you can go there and find, firstly, the audio video recording. You can watch each of the sessions. You can also access the slide decks that were used to present the content. These would be excellent, learnings not only for you as policymakers, as practitioners, as volunteers, but for sharing in your networks and your sector. And you can see that I've referred to some of the topics already in my talk with respect to the safe return, inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, and physical activity, recreation, and community sport as being essential. This again speaks to the notion of contribution, about positioning our collective offerings, including yours, in a very dynamic and changing socioeconomic climate. If we don't figure that out and know who we are, what we offer, why we offer it, and how it contributes, then we will not build back better. And that's an objective of every sector of society. And so the outdoor spaces one and the essential service one, I think, would be of particular. The last on technology, it may seem less important, but it's equally important in the sense that in the outdoors, we are all using different forms of technology to support our metrics, our participation, to increase the outdoor play and outdoor access experience. They pose opportunities, but they also pose challenges in terms of use of technology. And you'll see from that session, the section of which I gave on technology will be perhaps of interest, if not importance to you as well. So next slide, please, Louise. In addition to the workshops on the bench, you will find a whole series, perhaps dozens now, of infographics and research snapshots that articulate in easy access ways the information that was gathered by the ReImagine RREC initiative. There is at least one or two for each of the workshops. There are 5 knowledge transfer tools for another webinar that we delivered on the overall findings from RREC in June of 2021. We had no fewer than 550 professionals in recreation, sport, climate, community planning, public health on the line for that webinar. And so I would encourage you to go to the bench, sign up if you're not a member, and access these infographics. They are excellent to use to make the case for our global work in recreation, physical activity, and many of them, as you can see here, and I'm going to unpack some of these in my last sort of 3 or 5 minutes, speak to the outdoors and the notion of unstructured movement, health enhancing movement, including play. Next slide, please. Louise, jump in if I am perhaps maybe nearing the end or running out of time. So demand for outdoor spaces and unstructured movement. None of this is new to you, but I want to underscore the fact for you that the ReImagine RREC initiative and CPRA in its findings from RREC could not be more acknowledging of the critical importance of this issue for Canada, for the recreation sector, and for those of you who are delivering on this offering in your respective communities. 80% increased demand for parks and outdoor spaces. That's a pan-Canadian figure. You probably saw upwards, as I mentioned earlier, in some cases, demands that increased by 1, 2, 3, 500% in a matter of days. And the challenge that posed and still poses, but the opportunities that are brought forward by figuring that out and building on that going forward. On the right, 7 out of 10 people value access to the outdoors more now. This is fundamental in terms of how people think about where they're going to spend their time and where the access and provision of outdoor play opportunities represents a newly visible opportunity for Canadians, but also others obviously across the world. And unstructured recreation on the bottom left and general physical activity. The notion that as an example, young families of young children who, we've heard the term helicopter parents, and the fact that children have been over-organized in their lives, sometimes participating in 3, 4, if not more, organized activities on a weekly basis. People were forced to obviously be by themselves during lockdowns, to be connected as families, to spend more time as families, and where the limited opportunities for health enhancing movement were provided to them, and it differed across the country and it differed across the waves. Families and people have told us, the ReImagine RREC initiative, that the family time that has been afforded Canadians has remained something that they want to keep, and the idea of returning to organized sport is less important. In fact, one statistic, which I think is later in one of my slides, we found that up to 50% of those who go to organized gyms and recreation facilities were, at the time of the findings from ReImagine RREC, considering never going back. Part of that is a safety issue, but part of that also now, for many, is a socioeconomic issue, an affordability issue. And that's a consideration. And it is an opportunity, indeed, for those of you who work in outdoor play, because the costs, generally speaking, are less to participate in unstructured outdoor activity than they are in structured indoor sports and recreation. And many Canadians, this one from the Toronto Foundation, support moving activities outdoors. There's a facility based in Calgary. Heather would probably know of it. It's called the Vivo. Vivo is a Spanish word for life. The Vivo facility is going through an awesome transformation. It's a major paradigm shift for how the provision of community services writ large, not only recreation, sport, physical activity, play, but community services, including library access and other services, are being transformed, in that the Vivo Center will have things like it's currently being developed, and I don't know, I can't speak to the specificities of timing, but it will have an indoor park, and you may have heard of the new term as a consequence of the pandemic that has been brought about by our community to ensure that we think about how to retrofit and build our facilities to ensure that we take advantage of the hybrid access, and that's twin doors, right? The idea that facilities are being retrofitted for access from and including the outdoors, but from and including the indoors as well. And that's how the Vivo Center is being developed. And you should know that their raison d'etre is about healthier generations, about helping kids and all subpopulation groups to live a healthier life. So that's just an example of where they're moving in that direction. So next slide, please, Louise. CPRA, as a consequence of initially they're being tapped by FPT governments to lead an effort to respond to one of the 6 areas of focus in the common vision, are leading an effort on developing an outdoor activation toolkit. Some of you may know about this. It's in play. It's being led by Troy Glover. Troy is at the University of Waterloo, of course, as some of you may know. And Places and Spaces is one of the 6 areas of focus in the common vision, which I'm proud, as Heather had noted, to have been involved in its development since 2015 until it came out and it was announced in 2018. And the toolkit, which is not yet available but soon will be, will speak to the myriad of opportunities for practitioners like yourself to make available access to supportive places and spaces, including through outdoor play, to engage Canadians, to help Canadians reclaim They're civic spaces, so not only those that are made for greenways and pathways and walkways, but you can see by some of these images that as we, in local communities, as we undertook efforts to make space, civic space, more available for Canadians, including by opening up parking lots and opening up, open streets, that the idea here is to take an evidence-based approach, to take an information informed approach to entrenching these opportunities going forward. And this toolkit will help you do that. So look for that in the upcoming months. I don't know the exact timing, but more on that to come. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, 5 minutes, and I think I'm probably over. Okay, so yeah, just go to resources and sources. I won't spend time on these. I'll say a couple of things. For this issue of access to the outdoors, it will be for you, and probably is now, about partnerships, collaboration. These resources here, all on this deck, all have hypertext links. So when you get the deck, you can just link to all of this information, including consideration of the sustainable development goals. There are about 7 of them that are relevant to community sport, recreation, and many to the outdoors. And you should determine, if you are not already, how you might want to demonstrate connection to them, and to also figure out and listen in and wait for news that comes out of the CPRA Climate Action Group as well. So opportunities to collaborate, learn, and potentially partner going forward. Next slide, please, Louise. So what's in play with respect to changing public preferences? These are some of the icons you've seen before, but I mentioned 50% of gym goers and 60%, bottom left here, want more access to nature and more to washrooms. Sometimes we don't think about the obvious, right? Outdoors, particularly from a perspective of seasonality. When the pandemic happened, there was still snow on the ground in much of the country, and yet washrooms were closed, outdoor washrooms in parks, things like that. Because I'm rushed, not rushed, but we're near the end, I'll make the point here, the following point, that there needs to be more data, more research, and a greater understanding of where the changing, because it's not over, the changing and emerging public preferences and expectations and behaviors of our clients and consumers writ large will determine how we deliver on our offerings and how you make available opportunities officially and unofficially within your communities for outdoor play. There are a growing number of new data that are arising. CPRA is looking at some of those, or considering its next steps, let's put it that way, with respect to REC, and trying to figure this out for its constituents, as are many provincial territorial recreation associations, obviously tied to CPRA. And this should remain at the forefront of your thinking in terms of what public preferences will be going forward. And to go back to a point I made earlier, one of the key ones that will remain at the top is obviously safety, not only from a pandemic preparedness point of view, but from a point of view of the greater number of people who are accessing our outdoor spaces. So I think I'm at the end. If you can go to maybe the last slide, there I am. If you did want to follow up and talk to me further than the Q&As here today, that's my contact information. So thank you for having me. I appreciate being here with you today.
Thank you, Joe. I don't know about everybody else, but my mind is just reeling about, I could think, but I think for me, what was really super interesting is that outdoors will need to double down, and that the City Maxima report that we shared, people are taking heed. So that gives me great comfort that that attention to the outdoors and the benefits and the partnerships that we must do now. I think the other thing that's super interesting is inflation, and what that role of inflation is going to do to sport, physical activity, and recreation. We know there's a report, so watch Twitter tomorrow, watch social media. Canadian Tire Jumpstart will be issuing a report tomorrow that talks about the return to sport and what the impact of that is. And again, I think you talked about the inequities that are happening with kids from a equity, diversity, and inclusion perspective. We need to pay attention to that. And that bucket is huge, both from an Indigenous, all kinds of perspectives. And I think for us at Outdoor Play Canada, it's just that continually learning and evolving and repositioning. And I'm really proud of that state of the sector report that we did in terms of updating the 2015 report on the benefits of outdoor play. We know kids move more. They have better, like it's emotional, physical, spiritual, all those kinds of things that we need our kiddos to do, and that risk and all of that. And it's not just for kids, it's good for us too. In our positions of leadership, holding people and leading people and making decisions, we need to make sure that we're looking after ourselves as well. And Joe, while I was listening to you, somebody was texting me going, Joe Doiron works harder now in his retirement than, so he works hard now, but thank you for sharing. I'm really proud of the work that CPRA is doing. We certainly want to be aligned with it and work collectively on it. So we're just about running out of time, but I just want to say thank you to everybody, and also want to point out to our great project manager for Outdoor Play Canada is Louise. So if you have any questions or thoughts about Outdoor Play Canada, membership is free. And we have got excuse my language, a